I'm going to try to disambiguate for you what we just received in the Mike Flynn case. Mike Flynn, of course, President Trump's first national security advisor. He pled guilty just over a year ago to lying to the FBI. We have since learned from the special counsel's office in public-facing court documents that Flynn has met with them 19 times and has been a very helpful cooperator to the prosecutors in the special counsel's office who have been investigating the Russia matter and also a couple of other investigations that we can't see any details about because they're redacted in those public filings. Well, just tonight, Flynn's defense counsel have filed with the court their essentially case to the judge for why Flynn shouldn't get any jail time. Now, they're not exactly arguing up a steep hill here, right? Because the prosecutors have already told the judge that Flynn has been so helpful, they wouldn't object if Flynn ended up serving the bottom end of the sentencing guidelines for a crime of his kind, which would be 0 time in jail. So the prosecutors have already basically given Flynn's defense counsel a good place to start in terms of not asking the judge to throw the book at him. But tonight they've just filed 157 pages with the judge in terms of saying what they think should happen. And it's a big stack of stuff. I don't want to mess up my my in-process ad hoc filing system that I just got on my desk because I was just handed this document. But basically, we've got this big stack of exhibits, which is all letters in favor of Mike Flynn being a good guy. We've got this big stack of exhibits, which is all stuff about Mike Flynn's illustrious military record. And then we've got the real meat of the matter, which is basically the case being made by Flynn's defense counsel to the judge. And it's interesting. All right. We're going to get some expert help. I can already tell there's a matter of law here that I definitely don't understand, that I can tell is important, and so we're going to have expert help on this in just a second. But let me give you, as I am going through this, I haven't made it through all of this myself yet, let me tell you what I'm seeing as I'm looking at this first document. Quote, the defendant, through his attorneys, submits this memorandum in aid of sentencing and respectfully requests that the court grant the government's motion for downward departure, meaning downward departure from a more lenient departure from the sentencing guidelines. We request that the court sentenced him, quote, to a term of probation not to exceed 1 year with minimal conditions of supervision, along with 200 hours of community service. So that's what Flynn's lawyers are asking for. A year of probation, minimal supervision, which means he doesn't need to report very much and he's not very constrained in his activities, and he'll do some community service. Filing continues, quote, General Flynn has accepted responsibility for his conduct. He has cooperated extensively with several Department of Justice investigations. As the government has made clear, his cooperation was not grudging or delayed. Rather, it preceded his guilty plea or any threatened indictment. Interesting. His cooperation preceded his guilty plea or any threatened indictment, and began very shortly after he was first contacted for assistance by the special counsel's office. Following extraordinary public service in the United States Army, during which his innovations as a highly decorated intelligence officer saved countless American lives, and a lifetime of faithful devotion to his family and fellow service members and veterans, as described in the powerful letters of support that accompany this submission, a sentence of non-incarceration is both appropriate and warranted. Now, again, a sentence of non-incarceration is not going to be a hard fight when it comes to Flynn, because the prosecutors on the other side of this case have already suggested to the judge that a sentence of non-incarceration would be acceptable to them. Now, that said, the two sides here aren't the only parties to this sentencing decision, and it has happened in the past where prosecutors and defense counsel have both suggested that somebody shouldn't get jail time, particularly in like big public corruption cases or other cases that are high profile where there's been an important cooperator, as the special counsel's office says Flynn has been. There have been cases like that in the past where the judge in the case has nevertheless said, I don't care that neither of you think he should go to jail. I think the guy should go to jail. So just the fact that both sides are asking for no jail time doesn't necessarily mean that Flynn is going to get no jail time. But now we've seen both sides, from the prosecution and the defense. Now, as indicated in that preliminary statement, what the defense here sets up, and is the bulk of this filing, is a recitation of Mike Flynn's good works and his time in public service and in the military. There's, as I mentioned, two big sets of exhibits. These are all letters of support in favor of Mike Flynn, all people who say he's great. And these are all documents, including some handily redacted documents from his military record that spell out his public service, including his extensive career in the United States Army. It goes through his commendations, his combat service, etc. So page 2, 3, 4, 5 of the filing seems to go through his time, even going back to his biography, growing up in a modest working class, in modest working class circumstances in a tight-knit family in a small house in Rhode Island. Goes through his time as a lifeguard. Aw, lifeguards can't go to jail. And then he becomes a paratrooper. He's in the 82nd Airborne Division. He becomes a general. He becomes the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He has an extensive combat record. They go through all of that, including his time with Special Operations Command in Iraq. Goes through his time being involved in veterans charities. General Flynn and his family are very active in their local Catholic communities, and it gives his Catholic church details. Then we get to what he did and why it's not so bad that he should go to prison. The nature and circumstances of the offense. Quote, General Flynn does not take issue with the description of the nature and circumstances of the offense contained in the government's sentencing memorandum. As General Flynn has frankly acknowledged in his own words, he recognizes that his actions were wrong, and he accepts full responsibility for them. There are, at the same time, though, some additional facts regarding the circumstances of the FBI interview of General Flynn on January 24th, 2017, that are relevant to the court's consideration of a just punishment. Now here, this is new, and this is fascinating. So again, remember the time frame here. Trump was only sworn into office on what, January 20th? It was by January 26th. The Justice Department, hair on fire, is up at the White House with the acting attorney general in person, meeting with the White House counsel saying, your national security advisor is compromised by the Russians. This is a counterintelligence emergency. You need to do something. Part of the basis for that warning was the fact that the FBI had come in and interviewed Mike Flynn about his contacts with the Russian government. The U.S. government, law enforcement, intelligence agencies were well aware of what Flynn had been saying to the Russian government. The Russian government was also well aware of what Flynn had been saying to the Russian government. Flynn lying about those conversations, both publicly and then to the FBI when he was questioned about them, obviously put him in a position where Russia could blackmail him. Russia could compromise him. Russia could lean on him to do what they wanted because they know something about him that he feels is important enough to lie about, even to the point where he's risking criminal exposure by lying to the FBI. So that's the whole way we get into the national security emergency around Flynn. But it all hinges on the FBI coming to the White House to talk to him. You're about to hear in this new filing a whole bunch of new detail about the FBI coming to talk to Mike Flynn the first week of the Trump administration, how that went down, and what Mike Flynn says was wrong with that interaction. All right, here we go. Quote, at 12:35 p.m. on January 24th, 2017, the first Tuesday after the presidential inauguration, General Flynn received a phone call from then Deputy Director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, on a secure phone in his office in the West Wing. General Flynn had for many years been accustomed to working in cooperation with the FBI in matters of national security. He and Mr. McCabe briefly discussed a security training session the FBI had recently conducted at the White House before Mr. McCabe, by his own account, stated that he, quote, felt that we needed to have two of our agents sit down with General Flynn to talk about his communications with Russian representatives. Mr. McCabe's account states, I explained that I thought the quickest way to get this done was to have a conversation between General Flynn and the agents only. I further stated that if General Flynn wished to include anyone else in the meeting, like the White House counsel, for instance, I would need to involve the Department of Justice. General Flynn stated this would not be necessary and agreed to meet the FBI agents without any additional participants. Less than 2 hours later, at 2:15 p.m., FBI Deputy Assistant Director Peter Strzok and a second FBI agent arrived at the White House to interview General Flynn. By the agent's account, General Flynn was, quote, relaxed and jocular and offered to give the agents a little tour of the area around his West Wing office. The agents did not provide General Flynn with a warning of the penalties for making a false statement before, during, or after the interview. This is a new material claim in the Flynn defense. He's having this FBI interview under friendly circumstances with FBI personnel with whom he had reason to believe he was having a sort of cordial or collegial discussion with. They did not warn him at any time, according to Flynn's defense counsel, that if he lied to the FBI, even in jocular circumstances like that, he would be committing a crime. This is an interesting new claim. Okay. Back to the filing. Prior to the FBI's interview of General Flynn, Mr. McCabe and other FBI officials, quote, decided the agents would not warn Flynn that it was a crime to lie during an FBI interview because they wanted Flynn to be relaxed, and they were concerned that giving the warnings might adversely affect the rapport, one of the agents reported. Now, what that's being cited to is this footnote here, in terms of these quotes about what the FBI agents were thinking and what they decided. Here's the footnote that explains where they're getting these quotes. Certain information summarized or quoted in this memorandum derives from documents furnished to defendant's counsel pursuant to the protective order, United States versus Flynn, and then there's a case number. Undersigned counsel conferred with the government, which represented that disclosing the selected information does not constitute a violation of the protective order. So Flynn's counsel in this sentencing memorandum, they're disclosing stuff that they got from the prosecutors subject to some sort of protective order. They say they've gotten permission to disclose this stuff, but this is all new to us. All right, back to this. Again, before the interview, FBI officials had decided that, again, quoting, if Flynn said he didn't remember something, they knew he said they would use the exact words Flynn used to try to refresh his recollection. If Flynn still would not confirm what he said, they would not confront him or talk him through it. One of the agents reported that General Flynn was unguarded during the interview and clearly saw the FBI agents as allies. All right. Continuing, while General Flynn has fully acknowledged his wrongful conduct and comes before the court to accept the consequences, the circumstances described above warrant the court's consideration as it evaluates the seriousness of the offense relative to the circumstances of witness interviews in typical cases charged under the federal law that criminalizes false statements to investigators, including a couple of cases prosecuted by the special counsel that are discussed below. General Flynn's respect for the law is demonstrated by his decision to accept responsibility for his actions soon after the special counsel's office reached out to him and sought his cooperation. Even when circumstances later came to light that prompted extensive public debate about the investigation of General Flynn, including revelations that certain FBI officials involved in the January 24 interview of General Flynn were themselves being investigated for misconduct, General Flynn did not back away from accepting responsibility for his actions. A term of probation with minimal conditions of supervision is a just punishment. And then they go through previous cases that involve prosecutions of people for lying to federal officials, including references to Alex van der Zwaan, who pled guilty in the special counsel's case, also George Papadopoulos, who just got out of prison in the similar case. And then this is the end. The nature and extent of General Flynn's cooperation. We cannot say it any better than the special counsel's office has. Given all the circumstances, a sentence at the low end of the guideline range, including a sentence that does not impose a term of incarceration, is appropriate and warranted. General Flynn provided timely and substantial assistance to law enforcement. He agreed to a proffer with the special counsel's office upon its first request to speak with him, and with only the scanty protections of a typical Department of Justice proffer letter. As the government states, his early decision to plead guilty and cooperate likely affected the decisions of related first-hand witnesses to be forthcoming with the special counsel and cooperate. He participated in 5 pre-plea proffer sessions with the special counsel's office and 14 additional meetings with the government pursuant to his plea agreement entered on December 1st, 2017. In total, he participated in 19 meetings with the special counsel and other components of the government, totaling approximately 62 hours and 45 minutes. But who's counting? Additionally, General Flynn has produced thousands of documents to the Department of Justice. Even before his voluntary pre-plea proffer sessions, he had chosen to produce sweeping categories of documents held by his 2 companies rather than fight over the breadth of subpoenas. And he facilitated the production of electronic devices. After his plea agreement, he made another 5 productions of documents. A false statements case with a guideline range of 0 to 6 months, on top of which the government has moved for a downward departure, presents a particularly strong argument for a non-custodial sentence. Throughout the federal court system in fiscal year 2017, a total of 130 defendants faced sentencing where the primary offense category was either administration of justice offenses or other miscellaneous offenses, which is a residual category that includes the crime for which Flynn has been charged. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, the median sentence imposed in those 130 cases was 0 months. General Flynn devoted his career to serving and protecting the nation. Having made a serious error in judgment for which he has shown true contrition, he recognized it was consistent with the values by which he has led his life, simply to provide the facts to those charged with enforcing our laws. On the day he entered his guilty plea, he said he was working to set things right. He has done so. For these reasons, we respectfully request that the court impose a sentence of probation, as described above, and community service. So this is the filing from Mike Flynn and his defense counsel about why he shouldn't go to jail. They probably do not have a very hard case to make for him not going to jail. But what they are doing in this filing is saying, hey, the FBI agents who came and interviewed Mike Flynn, those are the bad guys here. There's a reason they're going out of their way to name Andrew McCabe, who is now gone from the FBI, and to name Peter Strzok, who is now gone from the FBI. There's a reason they've apparently gone out of their way to be able to quote from documents we've never previously seen before that were apparently from this protective order that explained what was in the minds of those FBI officials when they went in to meet with General Flynn, including their perception that he seemed relaxed. It's no material defense to the crime of lying to the FBI that you felt happy when you did it. But this is a public-facing plea for a reason, right? This shows that Flynn is trying to argue his case in the court of public opinion as well as with the court by saying that the FBI is the bad guys here. Fascinating. We're going to get some expert advice on what is most important here in just a minute. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.